welcome to this webinar on happy, healthy conflict, having difficult conversations at work. And I'm going to say a little bit about myself first of all, because I know there's quite a few people on the webinar who I haven't met before. And so I'm Melanie Greene. I'm an occupational psychologist, and I run Inspire Transformation. Been doing it for a very, very long time, over 25 years. But actually, the world of work has changed, and the world of psychology has changed. So what I do is very different. And I specialize in two areas, and one is around how people work together, or in lots of cases don't work very well together, how they communicate with each other in conflict. And the other area is about managing this and changing from the inside out. And so I'll touch upon that a bit because it links into conflict today, but the webinar in November is going to cover it in more detail. So just the practicalities of this is that it is being recorded, and hence everyone's on mute, and which means you can munch your lunch. I've already had mine. And that hopefully also that you've downloaded a little worksheet. I find it useful when you're listening to things like this. For me, it's useful to kind of take notes because I want it to be of practical use. A lot of you found the chat box. For any of you who've joined after I've mentioned it, it's at the bottom of the screen. Click the box and the chat box comes up. There will be times when I might ask you questions or for input where you can make some comments or ask questions. If you're calling in, then feel free to, after the call, if you've got any questions, email me and I'll get back to you. And I keep it to about 30 minutes because I think otherwise we've all got busy lives and we need to get on with those. And just and with that in mind is that if you do have to leave this webinar early, sometimes people do, rushing off to meetings, is that after the webinar, if you're not already registered with inspiretransformation.co.uk, please do sign up. If you receive my monthly coaching newsletter, actually it's a different mailing list, and there you'll receive my new Melanie's Monday Motivational Messages, or MMs for short. I also have this monthly coaching newsletter that goes into things in more depth, and I publicise these free webinars and other things as well. And in fact, I'm just starting to put together a new 8-week online program, which I'm going to launch in the new year. About being and doing and keeping going. So register with the website inspiretransformation.co.uk, and then you'll be kept up to date with all of these sorts of things. So let's dive into the topic. So happy, healthy conflict. And I use that term, and it's actually the title of my my second book, which is coming out next year, is because most people see conflict as something that is destructive and to be avoided at all costs. And that certainly was my kind of stance years ago. And then gradually, as I got used to dealing with conflict and I learned how to do it in a constructive way, I found that often relationships where working relationships where I've had some conflict, is that by working through that constructive way, I've ended up with a much stronger relationship. So I want this to be of practical use to you. So we're going to look at you and how you react to conflict. We'll look at personality and conflict and how different personality types relate to it. And your brain's response to conflict, and then look at managing the interactions. And so you're probably kind of thinking about, well, actually, if I'm talking about conflict and it's all about the interaction, but actually it starts with yourself and it starts with how you respond to conflict. So let's start there. Is that the first thing I want you to think about is yourself and conflict. Is that, and feel free, if you feel brave enough, feel free in the chat box to type as I'm speaking about what sort of situations at work that you find difficult. And sometimes people kind of say, well, actually doing a webinar like this, if you were hosting it, would be terrifying. Or standing up in front of doing a presentation, or negotiating a pay rise with your boss, or with clients if you're self-employed like myself. And different things people consider conflict, and people's responses are very different. Is that I tend to find that those people who find conflict difficult is they have they either get very fiery, so like the lion, they get very fiery, or they're the opposite and they want to run away. I was trying to find an animal to symbolize that, and I thought there's a little lamb running to his mum and hiding on top of of the lamb, of his mum, and actually both sides need to be able to manage their emotional response, to be able to respond to conflict in a calm and rational way. And that's what we're going to look at today. So, personality and conflict, and how different personality types react to conflict in different ways. And I sometimes use with individuals and with teams MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And one of the dimensions is the difference between thinking types and feeling types. And somehow I can't seem to get my picture out in the way, but anyway, thinking types and feeling types. And so it doesn't mean that thinking types don't think and feeling types don't feel. It's just they approach things, lots of things, in different ways. And one of the things that I've noticed, they respond to conflict very differently. So thinking types are much more kind of logical, and they'll kind of step back and take a very kind of calm and rational approach to conflict. Often actually they can be, you know, the devil's advocate. They can argue for something that they don't believe in, which is something as a feeling type that I could never do. It would really take a lot of kind of mental work to try and argue passionately for something I don't believe in. Whereas the feeling types is they're all about harmony, and they're wanting people to get on. And I was doing a big project in a national organisation, and it was kind of one of those top down, starting with senior leadership team. And I was with the sort of the next layer of management, and one of the HR managers and it's a kind of I think a myth that HR people are all kind of nice and fluffy. Is often actually they're thinking types, and they need to make kind of hard decisions. But one of the HR managers was a feeling type, and most of the managers in this organisation were thinking types. And in fact, I was being brought in to change their management style from one being very autocratic to a much more democratic way of working. And when she would go to meetings with the managers, they would have what they would call robust conversations, and they'd come away thinking, that was a really good discussion. And she'd come away and think, that was awful, you know, actually, that was conflict, and I hate conflict, and I feel terrible about it. And so they had a very, very different approach. So it's worth thinking about yourself and thinking, actually, you know, am I a thinking type? Am I a feeling type? Maybe you're somewhere, you know, you might not be at the extremes, but you might be somewhere in the middle. But also thinking about the people around you as well. And you can. So as I said, I'm a feeling type, and the things that I'm going to talk about today are some of the things that I've used to get more comfortable with conflict, and to recognize that actually going through those difficult discussions is often that's where you'll end up with harmony. Having had full on frank conversations, which still can be respectful. So moving on, as we only have half an hour. So the next thing I want to look at, and it's related to the kind of the personality type, is your brain and conflict. And so our brain is designed to keep us safe. It's constantly looking out for risks and threats. And some people, it depends on our temperament, but also our upbringing, on how hyper it is in terms of looking out for threats. So if you had a very safe, loving upbringing, it's going to be much sort of calmer. Whereas actually, if you had an upbringing where actually there was a lot of kind of threat around, I had a coaching client once who he grew up with a father who was alcoholic. And actually, you know, he was constantly, from a very young age, having to assess, you know, is it safe to speak up? Should I just stay in my bedroom? That's the safest place to be. His brain is going to be hyper vigilant then when he grows up. And well, he was growing up when I was coaching him and going into meeting situations, etc. And so the brain is, at any one time, it's in one or two modes. It's either a reward response, and that's a response where we're looking forward to something. So we might have something fun happening at the weekend, we might have a holiday coming up, or it can be smaller things. Or, you know, I love my work, I love what I do, and I look forward to it. So I will be experiencing the reward response, which I don't have time to go into at the moment in terms of what's going on, but lots of positive things that makes us feel good. Whereas the threat response is us wanting to move away. It's the brain saying, whoa, this situation, maybe you're in a meeting and somebody has suddenly disagreed with you, maybe not done it in a very skillful way, and your threat response. Or maybe you've got a deadline. So it's not necessarily, threat response doesn't have to be in response to other people. It might be that you have a deadline and your threat response. So and it could be, I always do a little bit of rehearsing before these webinars, and the first one I did this morning, amazingly, is to check out the technology, no sound. So did another one, then there was sound, and then when we kind of joined at the beginning of this, is that the same message as when I had no sound came up, and I was like, how am I going to know? And obviously I tested it out with you. Now the threat response was about to come up, and then it was like, calm it down, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So let's say a little bit more about the threat response before about calming it down. So you're dealing with a conflict, you're having the threat response, and it's that adrenaline rush, is our dopamine levels go down. There's lots of other, cortisol starts to flow around our system. That's the stress hormone, and we're gearing up for fight, flight, or freeze. But if you think about it, if you are in a conflict situation, you're in a meeting, or you're doing a presentation, or you're one-to-one, is that actually you can't fight, you can't run away, and freezing is often not a good option, but often that is what happens. And also is that the chemical responses are creating a tunnel vision. And it's very interesting. I was reading an article recently. It was one of the weekend magazines, and it was talking about people who are having to deal with those sorts of emergency situations where they have to take split-second sort of decisions. And the first interview was with the pilot who successfully landed the plane on the Hudson River a few years ago. And he only had 3.5 minutes from when the birds hit both engines and both engines went out till when he successfully landed on the river. And he talks about going into total tunnel vision. That's all he could think about was, what do I need to do? Where's the safest? And but most of us are not in that sort of situation. So if you are in, say, a meeting, and it's not going very well, and maybe there's a couple of challenging people in the meeting, going into tunnel vision actually stops you thinking creatively. Also, if you're in threat response, cortisol affects many parts of the brain, but it affects the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is where you store information, but also then you need to retrieve that information. And the thing is, it has loads of receptors, because it helps with learning, or where you learn everything, but also those receptors suck up the cortisol. So the moment you go into threat response is that you start to think, oh, I can't think, I can't think clearly. We become pessimistic, and our working memory goes. So everything about it actually makes us not in the best possible situation to actually deal with a threat, with a situation. So what can you do? Now, I would say is next month, I'm going to be talking in much more depth about managing your mind and your mood, and the effect that has on performance. So we'll go into some of this in more detail. But in terms of dampening down the threats and the brain's threat response, one is coming into the here and now, rather than your brain running away with itself about and panicking. That's not going to help anybody. Come back on the here and now. Breathe deeply. The fight flight, shallow breathing, getting us ready to fight and flight, but you've got to sit there calmly. And so just breathe deeply. Change your posture. So you might discover that your posture changes slightly, or sometimes quite radically. So I was coaching a new manager in an organization, And he was fine with his team, but he had real problems when he went to have meetings with other managers, and they were very robust. And what he found, he didn't like conflict at all, is as he was talking to me about it, he was slumping down in his chair, like I am now. And I said to him, I said, do you see what's happening here? That you're kind of slumping down. And he went, oh. And I said, do you do that in the meetings? And it was almost like he was trying to be as small as possible. So while all the kind of, it's a bit like parents, I'll come on to this later, were arguing, he would just kind of be, I don't want to be here. And so sometimes it's changing your posture and looking up briefly. Again, I'll talk more about this next month, but it engages your visual cortex. It has an impact on how you feel. So being able to take a breath and go, okay, right, this is what I'm going to do, and engage your wise self, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And if possible, sometimes removing yourself from a situation. So it might be saying, hey, look, why don't we just take a break? Let's go and get a cup of tea. Or I just need to go and have a loo break, or whatever else it is, can sometimes enable you to remove yourself and then come back in a different place. So any sort of any questions or any thoughts about this, feel free to type in the text box, and I'm just going to, I'll give another example in case people have told me I move on too quickly while they're busy typing. So I'll give you a chance to type if you do have any questions. And so I think it's recognizing that when dealing with conflict is that the focus can be so much about that other person, wanting that other person to change. And it's bringing it back into what you can do. And once you change and you start to feel more in control, then you're going to start to change that interaction. So nobody's come up with any questions, so hopefully it's all kind of plain sailing. So let's move on to looking at your interactions with other people and creating happy, healthy conflict. And so I'm going to share a model which many of you, or some of you, might have come across before, which is called transactional analysis, or TA for short. And this model can help us understand where we're coming from, and it increases our options in any given situation. And so what it means is, if I say something to you, that's one transaction. If you say something back to me, that's another. And if it's all going well, I don't really have to worry about this model. But if it starts to go wrong, I can think about where am I coming from? How do I need to change? So let me first of all talk about the modes that we can interact from. So the first one is parent. So whether you're a parent or not, you have an internal parent inside you. So when you were growing up and you looked at the grown-ups around you, you know, we kind of thought, oh, well, that's what being an adult. And we kind of internalize that. But actually, they're usually in one or two parent modes. There's a nurturing, caring parent. So the bit of us that if somebody is upset, even if they're at work, is that we care for them. We want to listen. We want to help them. If it's taken too far, it can rescue. We can end up rescuing them. And I have some managers who I coach who are actually, is that rather than coaching their own staff, it's like when their staff have problems, it's like, well, let me sort that out. Or even if their two staff are having problems with each other, is they, rather than coaching the two members to sort the problem out themselves, they go in and try and rescue it, and often it goes terribly wrong. The other side of the parent is the critical controlling parent. So the bit of us that gets angry and frustrated, why don't they do it like I do it? And we can end up very controlling, and we all fall into it sometimes, particularly if we're anxious. But taken to extreme, it can be overpowering or even bullying behavior. I'll come to the middle bit in a moment, but there's also the child. So although we're grown up, we don't necessarily all behave like grown-ups all the time. So there's the positive child, the fun, carefree, happy, creative child. It's really important in life, and it's important at work, because otherwise it's really dry and boring. We need to have that humour, that And it gives us energy. And you often, I sometimes work with people who are on the front line, whether it's kind of social workers or police officers or in the fire service, whatever it is I've worked with them all, is they often have quite a wicked sense of humor, because, you know, it's a way of being able to release some of that stress and pressure and coping with things. Then there's the adaptive child. There's a bit of us that goes along with social norms. And that's, you know, and that, you know, that's good to a certain extent. And I would say that outside of London, well, certainly here in Oxfordshire, we still queue at bus stops. And we can get into very critical parent mode when we're in London and other people don't queue at bus stops. But there are some people who are very adaptive child, and that means that they they don't want to rock the boat. They want to be told what to do. And then there's other aspects of the child. There's the fearful child. So I used to have a very strong inner critic and a very strong fearful child. I was anxious and threat response most of the time, hence finding it hard to deal with conflict. You might have sulky child inside you. So when I'm working with teams, I sometimes work with them just, you know, they're all getting on fine, but they want to improve. But I do work with quite a few dysfunctional teams. And it's usually an ongoing process, workshops also one-to-one. And in the one-to-one, sometimes there's usually somebody who will say to me, well, there's X in the team, and we dare not say anything to them when they're in a mood, because they will sulk for weeks and make everyone's life a misery. You might have the rebellious child. So, and that, you know, part of us, when I was younger, I didn't really have a rebellious child because I was too fearful, but I've got a lot more rebellious in my old age. And that rebellious child can stay with us. Is that my mum, who's 84, has a very strong rebellious child. She certainly, you know, if she spots that you're trying to control her in any way, she will rebel. So you're never too old to be a rebellious child. But sometimes, you know, there's a positive side, but actually often in the workplace, it's negative. And the middle one is about being adult. It's about being rational and logical. We have emotions. Of course, we're only human, but it's about being able to manage those emotions, manage the threat response. It's about respecting the other person's rights as well as my own. So I'm not going to walk over somebody else, but I'm also not going to allow them to walk over me. It's about win-win, going for a win-win situation. And people often think there's no such thing as a win-win. And it's a truly adult-to-adult conversation, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, is that if both of you are listening, asking questions, seeking to understand the other person, is you both might come out not getting everything you thought, but because you felt respected and listened to, you feel good about the process. And I have an example of this. Is I was coaching a manager in an organization, and he had discovered, he was a sales manager, and he looked after part of the world, so quite a large responsibility. And he discovered that some of the other sales team were on a higher salary. And so he talked it through with me, and he went to the sales director, and had a discussion. And when I saw him the next session, he said he had a really good session, a discussion. And, you know, he really felt listened to. He listened to them. They understood each other. And he said, although he didn't get a pay rise right now, they know where he stands. He knows where they stand, and they have promised to rectify it the next time round. And he felt good about the process, even though he hadn't got the pay rise right now. And that's a very kind of adult-to-adult way of approaching things. It's also, finally on the adult, is this taking responsibility. And that's both for your, somebody's just asked about the manipulative child. I will come to that in a moment. Is that taking responsibility for your actions, your decisions, and your mistakes? And how many times in organizations is that when things go wrong, everyone's pointing the finger at everybody else rather than taking responsibility? So just coming back, Timon asked about the manipulative child. It's interesting with manipulative child. I think that a lot of the times people are unconsciously manipulating other people. And I have a great example of this in that many years ago, I was kind of acting as an outside supervisor for an individual in an organization, and they stayed there for 2 years. And when they left, I was kind of passed on to the next person who was there, and then the next person. So I actually coached 3 people in this role. And one of their team members remained constant throughout those 6 years. And this woman, when she was really struggling, rather than being adult and saying, actually, I'm really struggling with this week, I've got these things on, can somebody else help me here? Is that she would sigh a lot and make a lot of noise. So she'd like pick up a sheet of paper, slam the it was papers. She wasn't just slamming down any papers, but she'd come into the office and down goes her notebook, or her it would be laptop nowadays. And what would happen was that eventually somebody would go, oh, just don't worry, I'll do this or I'll do that. Now, I doubt if she woke up in the morning and thought, well, if I sigh a lot and make a big fuss, then somebody will come and rescue me. Now, maybe she did, but she probably was unconsciously manipulating the situation. And if you do it enough, actually you are. Because and I've had situations where managers are trying to manage the performance of somebody, and every time they go and have a conversation about a tricky issue, the individual storms off. Either they storm off in tears, or they storm off, I've heard this various different variations, or they storm off in anger. And therefore, they avoid that situation. And what I always say to managers is, what you need to do is have a discussion with that individual about what is happening here. And if I quickly, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, I'm just going to flash through this, is that what is happening in these situations. And it's recognizing that if you might be coming from the adult, but then they might be coming from the child. And it's how do you get them, or maybe you've come from something's gone wrong and you've got very angry, and then you've triggered somebody's fearful child or their rebellious child, and you've got that childlike response. And so what it is about, you're the bit that you've got direct control over. So it's managing the emotions from the parent or the child, so that you can, and this is about going back to managing the threat response, so that you can get into that adult mode and ask questions to enable and show that you're listening, to enable that the other individual to either come down or up to the adult mode. Obviously, when I run courses around this, we go into a lot more, and we do lots of exercises around this. And I think it's recognizing that when you start to change, the other person eventually starts to. Sometimes it takes time because they're used to being in that well-worn a route or a rut that they're in. But gradually over time, and it takes time for you to react in a different way as well. So I'm going to go and summarize. As I summarize, if anybody has any questions, feel free to write in the chat box, just as I'm summarizing here. So we talked actually first of all about the personality and conflict, so the thinking and the feeling types. So think about that. Remember about managing your brain's threat response. So if it starts to kind of, you start down that negative route, recognizing actually you can do very simple things in the moment to bring yourself back. And when I'm running workshops on this or coaching people, is that we also discuss about how do you manage yourself day to day and manage your mood. And we'll talk more about this in the next webinar. Because of course, if you're already in a threat response and you're already stressed, if you suddenly face conflict, it's a lot harder then to actually do this sort of thing, because you're already up here and you need to come way down here. And so if you can manage your mood on an ongoing basis, it's a lot easier to do this. Aim for those adult to adult interactions, which doesn't mean there isn't a time when you need to be nurturing parent, and and to support and encourage each other. It's you know, it's vital. I was working with it was actually, I work in all different types of organizations in the both private and public sector, and this was actually, she was a head of English in a secondary school, and they had been deemed dysfunctional by Ofsted, and I was, whoop, in you go, Melanie, sort this team out. So I was working with them over a period of time, and the head said, when I talked about this, she said, oh, she said, I'm very good at nurturing people outside of work. I never thought of actually bringing a bit of that nurturing parent to my team. And her team were finding her very cold and not at all sympathetic to, because if you're English, teaching English in a secondary school, there's a lot of pressure on you for results the whole time. Also, just summarising, the fun child, remembering that's really important to be able to lighten the load and also build rapport with people, but it's avoiding the controlling critical parent. So finally, we're nearly at past, is just get you thinking about, and this I always ask people on my courses and my coaching, is what are you going to keep doing that's working for you around conflict? What do you need to develop further? So maybe it's your patience you need to develop further, or your ability to manage your threat response, or your ability to listen, ask questions when you're up against somebody who's, you know, disagreeing with you. And what do you need to let go of? And that's often people kind of say, well, actually I need to let go of fear of conflict, or impatience, or irritation, or whatever else it might be. And finally, particularly for those people who are not already on my mailing list, go to inspiretransformation.co.uk. If you've enjoyed this, you might, and I think you've all kind of stuck with it, so hopefully it's been useful and you're enjoying it. Is that do register with the website, and then you'll get Melanie's Monday motivational messages, you'll get my monthly coaching newsletter, and also information about the upcoming webinars. I'm doing about one a month. I will probably do one in December. And I've got this new program that I'm putting together, an online 8-week program called Being and Doing, and kind of looking at the being side to keep you moving towards your goals. And I thought January, a good time to start that sort of process. So nobody's put in any questions. Feel free to email me afterwards, or if you want to talk about anything in confidence, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I will send you the link to this once we've kind of edited it. I'll send you the link to this webinar. So it's now, I believe it's past. It's 31 minutes. So thank you so much for joining me on this webinar. I hope it's been useful, and I look forward to welcoming you and seeing you on another webinar, if not face to face. Thank you very much.